We've just left John the Baptist. Yeah.
Not left John the Baptist. Jesus was doing what John the Baptist was doing or his disciples were. They were baptizing people probably with the same idea that John was preaching, with a little bit of an extension, because John was saying you got to really take God seriously and change your mind. And Jesus was saying the same thing, but John was saying the Messiah is coming. Jesus was the Messiah. It doesn't actually clarify what the rest of the message was that the disciples were giving to those who came to them to be baptized. I'm curious. It'd have to be something about who Jesus was, you'd think, because that was the topic.
Yeah, so there was obviously some sort of, like, was it the Pharisees that were trying to stir up a little bit of tension between them and saying, well, his disciples are baptizing more than your disciples are. And so to avoid any further conflict, Jesus withdraws.
I think it was even more serious than that. I think the writing was on the wall as far as John the Baptist was concerned. Pharisees didn't like him. They asked where his authority came from, remember, in chapter 1 of John. And obviously John had given the thumbs up for Jesus as being the Messiah. Remember the special revelation that John was given, that he would recognize the Messiah when he came. And so the connection was very, very strong. The opposition to John the Baptist was strong as well. And it was just common sense for Jesus to recognize, as soon as the Pharisees heard that he was carrying on the same way with John's ministry of calling people to change their attitudes and wake up to the reality of God. And they must have, I wonder whether they put two and two together also and wondered whether Jesus was moving ahead with what John had said, that Jesus himself was the Messiah. So, yeah, Jesus didn't need to have any special kind of knowledge or revelation. Just knowing the facts of what was going on with the Pharisees was enough to tell him better to get out of the way for the time being.
So he does. So when Jesus learned that they were accusing his disciples of baptizing more, he just got away. He left Judea, set out once more for Galilee. He had to pass through Samaria, and on his way came to a Samaritan town called Sychar, near the plot of ground which Jacob gave to his son Joseph, and the spring called Jacob's well. It was about noon, and Jesus, tired after his journey, sat down by the well. Any significance here as the story moves forwards of the place, Sychar, Jacob's well? Do we read anything into that, or just where Jesus happened to be when on his way to Galilee through Samaria, which was the shorter route, but the one that they wouldn't normally take?
Yeah. I think it's just the place, because that kind of what it says there, near the plot of ground which Jacob gave to his son Joseph, and the spring called Jacob's well. There's nothing about that in the Old Testament at all. That's a local tradition, really. Whether it was, I mean, is it reported here as the word of God that Jacob actually did give the well to Joseph, or is it just reporting the tradition that happened? Because it was part of the Samaritan tradition. So,
Yeah. For some reason, John wants to locate what's happening here. Is he orienting his Jewish readers, helping them to understand where Jesus actually was?
I think there's a great thing going on. The last chapter, in chapter 3, it's the story of Nicodemus coming to Jesus, and how Jesus really challenged him to take the Old Testament seriously, and to take this spiritual rebirth that's back there in Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah, to take that seriously and to work out what that was. it was obviously part of Jesus' teaching, because he said that his disciples already understood this, and the Pharisees didn't. Even their teacher Nicodemus didn't understand that. So there's it's interesting how then against Nicodemus, who responds a little bit reluctantly, because it's because of the miracles that Jesus had been doing, that he came to him and said, "We know you must come from God, because no one could do these miracles of yours without God being with him." And then it shows Jesus going into the middle of Samaritan territory, meeting a woman, talking to her, and the whole thing about living water, I think, comes out of the circumstances. Jesus is thirsty. She's there to get water out of the well. He asks her for a drink. She says, "What's going on? You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan and I'm a woman besides. You Jews won't have anything to do with us. What's going on?" And Jesus turned it quickly and made it into a parable by saying to her, "If you knew what God gives and who it is who is asking you for a drink of water, you'd ask him and he'd give you living water to drink." So Jesus switches the conversation into a talk about spirituality, really, and deeper life, inner life. And the woman didn't need to see any miracles like Nicodemus did. And she
No.
doesn't argue. She just accepts what he says. And in the end, she believes. And the whole of, well, not the whole of the Samaritan village, I suppose, but a lot of the people in Sychar really believed that he was the Christ and that he was the savior of the world. All this in contrast to the Jews, who were still, even at the highest echelons, were still refusing to accept what Jesus was saying. And the rest of John's gospel just amplifies how the Jews, with their prejudices, would not accept that God could do something new and something as drastic as actually becoming a human being and living here. And
Yeah.
yet the Samaritans did.
So to go back a bit and back to the beginning of the story, this whole idea of Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman, it's probably hard for us to comprehend how socially unacceptable this was. The fact that she was a woman, the fact that she was a Samaritan. John points that out in the story and the way he tells the story. But for us, we don't have those sort of social norms that get in the way of that kind of relationship anymore, like talking to someone who's from a different culture or a different sex. It's hard for us to get our heads around it. But obviously, here Jesus deliberately has sort of broken through those social norms and those expectations. And he seems to do that without hesitation at times. It reveals something of his character.
Something of his character, something of his generosity, I think, just the wideness of his view. He knew that God was bigger than the God that the Jews believed in, that was only a start, but there was so much more to come. And that's what he chided them for over and over again, for not opening their eyes, accepting the evidence and moving ahead to believe in him. Yeah, it's not a matter of believing about him, but putting their trust in him. And over again, John says that those who trust him have life. Those who don't trust him are still in darkness. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It just seems extraordinary to me that for Jesus, that he could grow up so strongly in that culture, yet not be confined by the norms that they had in place. And so here he is speaking to a woman. I imagine if you spoke to a woman in that kind of setting and possibly with that sort of reputation, then the expectation would be that you're being immoral. And Jesus is not worried about that sort of implication about him.
I think, when I read it until recently, I thought of how Jesus probably went too far in talking to a woman alone, nobody around, out at the well. I mean, it's all set up for a seduction. But reading this through, it just seems to me that that John the Apostle was actually there with him at the well. It always seemed odd to me that the whole 12 of them went off to buy food in Sychar and left Jesus alone at the well. That's improbable. They wouldn't do that unless they were sightseeing or something rather like that. I don't think they were. And the story itself has got, you know, the interaction is so, it sounds so authentic and so real. And
you think there's details in there that suggest it's written by an eyewitness?
absolutely. It's either written by an eyewitness or it's written by somebody who can make up a good story. And I'm pretty sure this is like John always, he never refers to himself by name. He always avoids drawing attention to himself. When he has to say who he is, he calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. And here was an opportunity for him to tell the story without even saying that he was there. My conclusion now is that that sort of that moral, what do you call it? Disconformity. Jesus stepping outside the bounds of what is proper. Was it wasn't a real problem because there was another man there and that they were that he had company. So I don't know whether that's true or not.
So, yeah,
you don't know that it's
so
not true either.
Yeah. So he gets into this conversation with her about water. Give me a drink. What you would do? Ask for a drink. I'm a woman. And then he quickly turns that. If you knew what God gives and who it is that is asking you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. And so the conversation goes on from there. Again, we've got Jesus coming back to this idea of life. And I think this is the first time where he's talked about living water. Does he talk about living water in the prologue?
No.
He talks about life. This is the first time the idea of living water.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that idea in Jewish culture and for her? Obviously, there's going to be a bit of a pattern moving forwards here where he talks about himself and uses these metaphors to describe who he is. So living water, later on he talks about how he's the bread of life. In the other gospel, he talks about being the light of the world. Living water in the eyes and the views of the Jewish mind, what did that mean for them, do you think?
It is there in the Old Testament. If I could remember the texts, I just can't remember where it is. But there's a place where Yahweh, God, the God of Israel, talks about giving living water. Oh, yeah, it's in Jeremiah chapter 2, I think, where he says, Yahweh says to Israel, I've got two things against you. One, you've deserted me, the living water, and you've made cisterns for yourself, broken cisterns that hold no water. That's one reference.
Yep.
And in Isaiah, it's quite clear that when Yahweh talked about himself and the life that he was giving, he referred to his gift as living water. Again, it's a kind of a parable analogy that they were living in a pretty hard place at a hard time in the times of the prophets. And I guess drought was a real thing, but it was not just drought. It was rebellion and idolatry and bad leadership, both in the church and in the state. And to the faithful people, God said, well, here's living water. Come to me, and I will give you the refreshment that you need to continue faithful to me. So there was that thought in the Old Testament, and Jesus just drew on it.
Yeah. And there are some similarities, interestingly, in this conversation with this woman at the well to the conversation that he's had with Nicodemus, in that he starts the conversation with a concept that Nicodemus finds difficult, that whole idea of being born again, and he starts this conversation with a concept that the woman finds difficult as well. And it's all, both are tied up with his identity.
Exactly. And this conversation breaks wide open when she refers to the Christ and says that he's going to come, and when he comes, he'll answer all the questions that we have.
Yeah. So before that, she says, Jesus says, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. That's the question of you being greater than our ancestor Jacob, are you? And then Jesus says, but whoever drinks the water that I shall give him will never suffer thirst anymore. The water I shall give will be an inner spring, always welling up for eternal life. And then she says, give me that water, and then I shall not be thirsty, nor have to come all this way to draw. So amazing truth here that Jesus is revealing. Probably for the first time, he's giving someone a really deep insight into who he actually is and what he has on offer, and like an incredible sort of image of why would anyone not want that, to have that living water springing up from inside you.
Yeah. And, you know, the very thought of the water welling up suggests that there's life in the water itself. In fact, the word isn't just welling up, but it's spouting up. There's a violence to that new life that will come from taking Jesus seriously and drinking out of his life the kind of thing that he offered to the woman there at the well.
So she wants it, and then Jesus brings it home in a personal way, sort of for her, where he says, go call your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. Jesus says, you're right. You have no husband. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you're with now is not your husband. So the question that we always wonder in this is, does Jesus know this because of some kind of revelation from the Spirit, because he's the Son of God, or does he know it because he's observant, like he sees what's going on there, or is it a combination of both? And is that the same as how we have perception in different situations that we're in?
It's partly that, but I know I'm getting into trouble with this, but I think there are people who've got psychic powers who can tell you where the body is, for example. And it's sometimes a little bit hit and miss, but sometimes it actually works. And
Which body? Like if there's a missing body
of somebody who's disappeared, a murder victim, that sort of thing.
Yep.
Yeah, psychics who somehow or other are able to bring into their own minds something that comes from the bigger picture that they haven't actually seen with their physical eyes, but there's some faculty, some power that's within the human nature that is able to see beyond the boundaries of what we've actually physically encountered. I'm inclined to believe this because in a small way, Elvira, my wife, has a touch of this where she's able to, like, she'll talk about a visitor coming without any clue, and then all of a sudden there they are turning up at the gate unexpectedly. That's happened several times, and I've seen it in animals. We had a dog that belonged to our eldest son, who went off to school in when we were in Burke. He went off to Armidale to school, and he often came home just out of, like, he was only in high school, but he'd come home a bit unexpectedly, just turn up. But for about 4 days ahead of time, his dog would become anxious, I think, and sit looking down the road waiting for him. And we knew something was going on. Okay, maybe it's a long straw and I'm drawing wild conclusions, but I think there is more to human life than what we know, because sin has dulled our senses. Jesus, without sin, probably had every capacity that a human being can have. And for goodness sakes, we're actually spiritual beings. the main part of us is this bit that is made in God's image. So human beings, who knows what a human being without the handicap of sin and self-centeredness and all that alienates us from God, who knows what a human being is capable of? And it could well be that Jesus' knowledge, like when he said to Nathaniel, I saw you underneath the fig tree,
Yeah.
that there was some kind of, what else to call it, a psychic power that is inherent in human life that some people have just a touch of, and Jesus had fully 100% operative.
Yeah.
How's
And
that?
well, yeah, there it is. So he's on the money because she says you are right. I can see that you are a prophet. And then she shifts it away. I don't know whether she's getting nervous at this point, because then she starts talking about that sort of competition between the Samaritans and the Jews. She says, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say that the temple where God should be worshipped is in Jerusalem. So she brings up a bit of the religious controversy that goes back to that sort of separation. The Samaritans was kind of the bastards, I guess, children of Israel who mixed with the people after the Assyrian exile.
Yeah, 722 BC. That's a long time ago.
Yeah. And so she sort of brings up that controversy. That's where they started worshipping, but the Jews kept worshipping in Jerusalem. What do you think's going on there for her? Why does she bring that up?
The more important question is, why did Jesus make comment about her husbands? Why did he remind her that she had had 5 failed marriages and that she'd finally given up on marriage and was living with a bloke without even making the effort to make it decent?
That's
So
true.
he was actually showing her brokenness, showing her that her attempt to find satisfaction in life had failed. Well, it had failed 5 times. And he was prepared to kind of give her that sense of, I mean, it's almost like a miracle when he tells her this information about herself. And she goes off and tells everybody, come and meet the man who told me everything I've ever done, which goes pretty deep. But I think what he's done is he showed her that her quest for love and for acceptance and for the kind of life that is somehow or other we long for has failed miserably. And she's then seeing, well, all right, we're talking now about life. How do we find out the big answers? What is life meant to be? Is this normal that I should fail and fail and fail?
Yeah.
And she turns to her tradition and the difference between the Jews and the Samaritans. And Jesus is prepared to go there with her and to talk seriously about the bigger picture, even if it's coming not from her brokenness, but from her knowledge of a tradition. And remember, I think she is herself looking for answers. She wants to know why she's failed over and over again. And more than that, she probably wants to know which is the way to the satisfaction that I long for deep in my heart.
Yeah. So you think it's a genuine search for truth because Jesus has exposed something of the brokenness in there. She's not just trying to distract him from, but she's actually searching for it and maybe open to the idea that it's not found on their mountain.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that.
Just to take a little bit of a sidestep here, what's the lesson for us in this as we interact with people who don't have a faith yet? Do we have a role like Jesus to sort of show some of that brokenness, and how do we deal with that sensitively to, on one side, sort of highlight the brokenness that we might see or that is going on in a person, and the destructiveness of that, but then also to be sensitive and not for it to become sort of a negative hellfire and brimstone sort of situation.
I'm probably not the person to ask about how to do that sensitively.
Okay, well, tell us how to do it unsensitively.
Just tell them. The important thing, though, I think, is that Jesus put himself within the framework of thinking of the woman.
Yeah.
He didn't sort of barge in from outside, and say, you're totally wrong, you've got to listen to my message. But he listened and he worked sympathetically in. He was still prepared to say, well, look, you Samaritans are worshipping what you don't know, because, and we Jews do know who we're worshipping. He was affirming once again that God had revealed truth to a chosen nation, Israel. And if you really want to know truth, then you have to listen to the message that Israel received. Because he did say salvation belongs to the Jews. Belongs to them, but they didn't want to really take it themselves, you know. It's really ironic.
Yeah. So then, so you pointed out that idea that they worship what they don't know, the Jews worship what they do know. Salvation comes from the Jews. And then, but the time approaches, indeed is already here, when those who are real worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. Such are the worshippers whom the Father wants. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. I really love this idea because it sort of it moves worship and response to God away from being tied to a place or a temple to the response of the heart towards
Absolutely.
God and towards the Messiah. And it sort of frees up worship to be an act that can come out of anywhere, wherever we are. It's just that attitude of that tied up together is worship in spirit and in truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. He's saying real worshippers. And that's the real danger, I think, that there is a reality that God has defined. His revelation, the Word of God, clearly spells out the reality that is the final reality, the true world that we are part of as God's creatures. And you have to be in that reality. You can't make up your own religion, even though great slabs of the human race have made up their own religion and defend it and prepared to fight over it, and yet and kill others and so on. But still, what God has revealed is the reality that we have to deal with, and in that we find that there's a God who loves us, who really wants us to be in a relationship with Him, and the relationship with God has to be not from building temples or writing books and singing hymns, but our relationship with God has to be out of His image in us, the bit that makes us like Him, the Spirit. True worship has to be spiritual. And I think, I
But
know,
also tied to the truth.
and tied to the truth. Yeah,
Yeah, so those two things working together, that
absolutely.
spiritual connection coming out of the image of God in us and that spiritual connection. But also it can't just be that. It's got to be tied to, is it to the revelation? Is that what the truth is? God's revelation through Israel and then through Jesus?
And also His revelation through nature. And even in our deepest own conscience, I think that we humans have like, the Jews used to mock at people making idols, you know, cut down a tree, make half of the log into an idol, and the other half you use to cook your dinner. You bow down and worship the other half that you've carved into some kind of an idol. Uh, Even the Greeks gave up idolatry well before the time of Christianity. They knew that God was not like their idols. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I wonder if that's probably been nearly the end of our time.
Oh,
We've got a lot more to look at in this section, and I'd like to explore that a bit more. And then he goes on to talk about how he reveals to her that he is the Messiah, and then her response. But I think we'll pick up that next time. So, yeah, thanks again, Laurie, for your time and your insights. Any last thoughts with all of this?
I appreciate so much you taking all my words and putting them nicely together and clarifying them for me as much as anyone else.
Yeah, well, it is very rich, kind of that kind of backwards and forwards. Yeah.
What I like in this, the way John has told the story of Jesus, there's not a whole lot of it, you know. It's only just a few of the things that Jesus did. John says so in John back at the end of the book of the gospel. But I think if you stand back and say, well, why does he talk about this Samaritan woman that none of the other gospel writers talk about? And why does he put it beside talking with a member of the Sanhedrin,
Yeah.
a wealthy Pharisee? And he shows these Samaritans that the Jews despised welcoming Jesus when the Jewish leaders were still skeptical and threatened and trying to avoid the message that Jesus was giving. You know, I
Yeah.
think John was brilliant in putting those things side by side, and
Yeah.
he wants us to see, that you don't need a great theological education like Nicodemus, and you don't need to belong to a special people and have a special temple and to have the great traditions of religion behind you. It's just even a broken person, a person who's failed over and over again, who takes what they know with an open heart and is still prepared to look for the fulfillment of the deepest hopes in our hearts. And they're the people that Jesus wants to find still.
Yeah. And I love that picture automatically as you read it. As the reader, you identify with those characters as you go along, and there's something in you that's crying out saying, this woman gets it. And then you're crying out when in your heart when you're reading about Nicodemus, thinking, why doesn't he get it? Why won't he just give himself completely into this? But yeah, it's great stuff. All right. Well, thanks, Laurie.
Thanks, Lucas. Enjoy. Yeah.